Good evening, everyone. This is Ashwin from the Global Alliance for Mass Entrepreneurship. This is a conversation with Professor Santosh Mehrotra, Professor of Economics at JNU. He's one of the most seminal kind of thinkers, academics, and experts on the informal economy, as well as kind of labor issues in India. What we're doing with 60 Days, 60 Voices is really speaking to different actors in the ecosystem who have an influential voice, who are thought leaders in thinking about job creating entrepreneurship or mass entrepreneurship, and hoping that these conversations drive new collaborations, new thinking in how we can all together as an ecosystem support mass entrepreneurs, job creating entrepreneurs through this crisis. As you can imagine, and as everyone has been talking about this crisis, this is a very, very unprecedented situation for the country and the world. And our support and our work together to support these enterprises can go a long way. In that vein, would love to introduce and thank Professor Mehrotra for joining us on this conversation. Professor, to kick things off, wanted to understand your view on what has been the impact of COVID and this crisis on informal micro entrepreneurs.
The impact has been humongous. In many ways, this is a greater impact, a much worse impact than the impact of the demonetization. There are several reasons for this. The first reason is that the economy was already in slowdown mode compared to the sort of mid-2016 when the demonetization happened. And what is now expected as a result of the COVID impact is that we may well go into negative territory for output and incomes as the year proceeds. The second big difference, in a sense, is the following: that in some ways, once you came out of the demonetization, it was likely to look up consistently. There was not going to be a second demonetization. But here you cannot say that. There may well be a W wave, meaning a return of the coronavirus, and the return, if it happens with as much viciousness as it has happened recently, although we have escaped unhurt almost compared to Europe, North America. But the fact remains that we are also a weaker economy and we have much less fiscal space. So therefore, its effects are going to be more damaging. And the problem is that there has been precious little change between the demonetization and now. There's been some change in respect of formalization, but 90% of our workers are still informal. They were then, and they are still now. It used to be 93% then, it's 91% now. And the unorganized sector share in, meaning those units, non-agricultural units, which employ less than 10 workers, that share is still a whopping 80%. So our vulnerabilities are absolutely huge. There is just no comparison with other countries of the world, other emerging market economies of the world, and G20. Yeah.
Got it. And if you think about kind of prioritizing where should we put scarce resources as an emerging economy in supporting these small businesses and micro entrepreneurs, obviously there are some fiscal measures, and we've also been speaking to some partners about how non-fiscal measures can be realized. So how would you think about prioritizing resources? If that's solving for the liquidity problem, for example, how would you think about prioritizing resources? Where should liquidity go? Where should funding go to help micro enterprises survive?
So the first thing let me pick up on the word liquidity. One of the most serious problems that tiny enterprises face, working capital is very severely short for going concerns, for going small entrepreneurs. And there is a very strong case to be made for those who have borrowed those who have borrowed from banks or from NBFCs or from MFIs, for them to get an extension of the moratorium. There is a moratorium sort of for 3 months on repayments that the government has announced for small firms. But the point is, most of them borrow from NBFCs and MFIs, and they have not been given this 3-month moratorium. So the first point is there should be an extension of the moratorium from 3 months to 6 months, and I think both NBFCs and that are particularly exposed to small and medium enterprises must get a moratorium increase. But an additional thing, which is non-fiscal again, it's on the banking side, is the need for an increase in bank availability for entrepreneurs in the form of working capital. Meaning, suppose the entrepreneur has borrowed from the bank, has taken a term loan, but an equivalent amount of 50% to 75%, depending upon the size of the unit, can be granted in the form of working capital. This is one particular thing that some of us are proposing. On the fiscal side, and this is not going to take too much money actually. One thing that I've consistently been arguing for a long time is an approach which supports the 5,500 clusters, manufacturing clusters which exist in our country, 1,400 of which are modern industry clusters. The remainder are handicraft clusters spread out across the country, and our cluster development programs are of a very weak design, and there needs to be integration of cluster development programs at the cluster level, meaning all the services that are offered, whether it is credit or technology upgradation or market development or design support. You know, small enterprises, new ones or those which are slightly older, they all need these 4 services. And GAME needs to get into these 4 services. The government and GAME needs to partner with government at the cluster level. The skill development also at the cluster level. If it doesn't happen at the cluster level, then you get very fragmented interventions. Each one of them being started by different ministries, and that's not working at all. But there is one other thing which I think is really not fiscal again. So so many of the things that need to be done for the SMEs are not fiscal. We just need to get our policy environment right. Now, that is that there are plenty of entrepreneurs who are facing very severe crises in respect of their supply chain, which have broken down. They're not finding workers if the workers were migrant workers.
Right.
And it's absolutely critical that the government might consider coming up with some grant-like support for a 1 or 2 year period for a limited number of such entrepreneurs.
Right.
Limited number, chosen very carefully, and it needs to be a grant-based support, because these people usually tend to be relatively young. They are facing all these multiple shocks simultaneously. The artisans, perhaps, for instance, who they might be working with, they are not being able to sell because these entrepreneurs are facing these multiplicity of constraints. So let's see what the government can do to tide over entrepreneurs through a grant-based mechanism, which is sort of given out on a competitive basis. And then game comes in with support. With, it should be a public-private partnership kind of thing. This has to be worked out carefully. I have a sort of, simple design for this as to how institutions in every state, in fact, and almost in every district actually, can actually do this. So there are many of these kinds of things that have to be thought about.
Yeah, and on the working capital piece, at least I think we are trying to put together a $100 odd million fund, so about 700 crores, 750 crores, where these can act as top-up loans for existing NBFC MFI borrowers. So that has almost a bias towards well-performing entrepreneurs, right? That they've paid their recent loan up to February, for example, pre-COVID, and they get a top-up loan that allows them to pay their dues for the next 3 months, retain
Brilliant.
retain some labor, and so on and so forth. So that's what we're trying to operationalize. And I think I also wanted to ask you this, that one of the things that we are perhaps concerned about is that there is a lot of liquidity measures were announced for NBFCs, MFIs by the RBI yesterday or day before yesterday. And the concern perhaps is that there is a bias towards the high rated NBFCs, MFIs, which might then lead to perhaps us not reaching a micro entrepreneur or a micro entrepreneur in remote parts of the country. So we are trying to create that vehicle that becomes a template for how do you reach these hard to reach but well performing entrepreneurs. Is that your sense as well, based on the kind of announcements that have been made on?
This has been a long-standing problem.
Yeah.
It's inevitable that, government and banks usually prefer to deal with the bigger entities, whether they are MFIs or NBFCs, for reasons that we all understand. And which is precisely the reason why the role of game in the hand-holding of entrepreneurs so that they can approach NBFCs and MFIs in a way that, the rates of interest, for instance, are not jacked up just because by the NBFCs or MFIs, just because the transaction costs of dealing with a multiplicity. So, I'm glad that you use the word, I think I heard you use the word, some pooling.
Yes.
So pooling is absolutely critical if
And aggregating, yeah.
Aggregating the pooling, if game plays that role, that would be outstanding. That would be a sterling importance.
And that's also why you talk about the cluster as a unit of change.
Absolutely. I mean, there are many reasons why I talk about clusters, because young people are entering the labor market in increasing numbers. But, particularly girls would like to get into jobs. Whether they can get into entrepreneurship or not, we have to wait to see. First, let's at least let them acquire some experience of working in a close by, in a cluster. In other words, young people, boys or girls, are getting educated in Mufassal towns and in villages all over the country. And they are the ones who are entering the labor market and finding that the labor market is not creating any jobs. So the clusters are there, the jobs are there. So let us provide, not only a multiplicity of manifold services, which I earlier talked about, but also the skill development for these youngsters. Because these young people are coming out with very, relatively poor education. Their skill development or their technical vocational education training is limited. And if you were to provide them with skills right there and then they don't even have to leave home, because the premium for skilling in terms of wages, higher wages, is not that great still.
Yeah.
And SMEs don't like paying more just because you're skilled.
Right.
So we've got to fix this problem of the jobs being there, but the non-availability of skilling facilities, that problem needs to be solved.
One of the threads of conversation that we've been picking on is how can this crisis be an opportunity for a new normal in the MSME space, and that means how can we push many more towards formalization? How can we push? How can we refocus efforts on sectors that are truly competitive, and perhaps ease out over time some of the sectors where we are not, where job losses are going to be high, competitiveness is going to be low. So, I mean, there are some of these conversations, what are emerging opportunities that MSMEs can tap into, and how can we support? Uh, what do you think about the timing of a conversation like this, I suppose? Because on the one hand, we hear, folks who work with entrepreneurs on the ground saying that formality, for example, is a trust question, that today entrepreneurs do not trust the system. It is also a cost benefit question in that they don't see the value of formalization. In fact, they see mostly costs, mostly kind of coming under the government eye and so on. So what are good ways of thinking about, say, sticking to formalization, a good way to think about transitioning to something like that as a new normal through this crisis?
There's been some degree of formalization that has happened on account of the introduction of the GST, and that is a very important reason why, as I was saying earlier to you, that within the last 2.5 years, we have seen an increase in the share of workers in units, erstwhile informal units, which have turned formal because they've registered under GST, and therefore they've also ended up registering under the EPFO, etc. So they have, now got, workers in those units have got access to social insurance. Now, that process has sort of run up against a brick wall. And you put your finger on it, and I've actually written on it, and I will share a couple of papers with you. I have actually examined the Asian experience of what triggers the conversion of erstwhile informal firms into formal ones. And I'm glad you figured out that, simply ensuring ease of doing business doesn't help them. Ease of doing business is something that needs to be done regardless, in any case, for the smallest of firms. That's not where unfortunately the focus has been. What does work for them is when they see genuine financial, tangible benefits from that conversion from the informal to the formal. There is evidence to this effect. I'll share with you Asian evidence to this effect. I don't think we have the time to talk about it just yet. It's perfectly possible to eliminate the concerns associated with trust the moment you ensure that there is, from the point of view of the entrepreneur, that if they become formal, there are real benefits to be drawn from that. That means we have to make sure, by we I mean the government has to make sure, civil society actors working with government have to make sure, because the government officials have to be sensitized to what is the bottleneck which is preventing, informal firms who would want to become formal from actually taking that jump. So I think there is a case for demonstrating to currently informal enterprises who are not willing to register for anything, even GST, let alone anything else, that there are real benefits to be drawn. But that means, real change at the lower levels of the bureaucracy, in the NBFC banking system, in the support system through the cluster development. Multiplicity of actions have to happen. And we together with GAME, all of us have to work in that direction. If we don't work in that direction,
right,
we are in for very, very big trouble, because I want to emphasize the following. The number of entrants into the labor force is increasing every year since 2012. That number will increase at an accelerating rate from this point onwards until 2030. It will continue to increase, the number of entrants into the labor force looking for work, even beyond 2030 to 2040, but at a decelerating rate. So it's absolutely critical that over the next 10 years, we generate jobs much more rapidly and clearly it has to be done in manufacturing. It has to be done through entrepreneurship by SMEs. Uh, and if that was to happen, these workers will get absorbed. If they don't get absorbed, the dividend, the demographic dividend, which we love keep talking about, will not only disappear, there will be social conflict on the streets of the country uh, in a way that we are already beginning to see as a result of the reverse migration set in motion by COVID-19 lockdown.
Well, I hope that's a message that we're all able to internalize and really act on in the coming years. To close, Professor Mehrotra, any kind of messages to the ecosystem, calls to action?
Yes,
For
one very specific thing that has sort of dawned on me in recent days, and it is the following. I discovered to my utter horror that the majority of unicorns in the Indian ecosystem of entrepreneurship are all funded through venture capital from China. And this is very problematic, which means that there isn't enough venture capital available for entrepreneurs who are up and coming and who are doing relatively well. They have to go to firms which are funded by the Chinese. And we have all seen that the Chinese have behaved in an extremely predatory manner historically, and they're doing it right now. And honestly, I think one of the tasks that of all organizations in this space, game needs to play is that where young firms by young entrepreneurs which are beginning to do well, we begin to mobilize venture capital for them in a way that has not happened in the last 10 or so years in our startup space.
Fantastic. On that note, thank you so much, Professor Mehrotra, for your time. And I hope these are lessons and messages that the ecosystem internalizes, and hopefully we'll have many more conversations sparking from this particular conversation. Thank you so much, sir.